No te oímos, María Belén.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Estamos muy contentos esta tarde de reanudar junto a Fragmentos y el Goethe Institut esta nueva charla eh, sobre el trauma y el monumento fugitivo. En esta ocasión tenemos el grandísimo honor de tener a una de las personas más lúcidas en el pensamiento contemporáneo de una nueva perspectiva que se abre claramente a la práctica de la memoria histórica y del arte en el mundo, y es Mechtild Widrich, austriaca, doctorada en el Departamento de Arquitectura del Instituto Tecnológico de Massachusetts, MIT, y profesora asociada de Historia del Arte, Teoría y Crítica del School of Art Institute of Chicago. Es autora de un célebre libro que ha servido de referencias a muchos artistas contemporáneos, incluido a Doris Salcedo, cuya obra se lee muy bien desde este análisis que ofrece el libro Monumentos performativos, la rematerialización del arte público, que fue publicada en el 2014 por la Manchester University Press. Quisiera saludar con mucha calidez a Mechtild Widrich por su dedicación a esta conferencia que ha trabajado para nosotros. Saludar también a la maestra Doris Salcedo, que nos acompaña, al director del Museo Nacional, Daniel Castro, al director del Goethe Institut, Wenzel Wilger. También nos acompañan todos, a todos ustedes que nos están acompañando hoy. Y nos queda pensar desde Fragmentos, que como saben es este espacio de memoria y arte, que es un contramonumento en donde la artista Doris Salcedo, con la colaboración de víctimas de la violencia sexual, por comisión tomaron las armas en cumplimiento del acuerdo de paz hace 4 años suscrito con las antiguas guerrillas de las FARC. Se entregaron más de 9.000 armas de alto poder, desmovilizando a más de 13.000 excombatientes, y con esas armas en un reciclaje del material, como lo aborda Widrich en su conferencia, en ese reciclaje del material y a través del trabajo de estas víctimas de la violencia sexual, reconvierten esa dureza de las armas en un gesto en donde las voces acalladas de estas víctimas hacen una marca ya imborrable en el entramado de la historia. Este monumento performativo hace parte de lo que podríamos llamar, o lo que llama la teórica, estos monumentos performativos. Ella en este momento va a hablar de materiales performativos y conmemoración activista. La propuesta de ella es bastante compleja, pero al mismo tiempo lo vemos realizado muy claro en proyectos, desde lo que podemos entender, ella lo va a exponer, es cómo desde la acción participativa de las personas, de la gente, del ciudadano, se configura la propia memoria, se configura la conmemoración. Es allí donde ocurre, en el gesto de esa comunidad participando en la elaboración de esa obra, que necesariamente se da en el espacio público, en la esfera pública, en un lugar en donde puede el ciudadano participar en la reconstrucción, en el pensamiento y en enfrentar el pasado directamente, sin mediaciones, para transformarlo y hacer un gesto político de gran hondura. Es quizá lo más importante para nuestra sociedad en este momento, cruzada por el conflicto y por la violencia, es que nosotros, cada uno, asuma el pasado, lo enfrente, para poder avanzar en una visión en donde cada uno asuma la enorme obligación de entender el momento histórico que nos cruza. Por eso Esta participación democrática es tan importante porque no se le deja a la historia como un lugar en donde se apilan acontecimientos, sino que la historia se enfrenta desde la singularidad de un momento que cada uno de nosotros enfrenta y acoge, en donde uno mismo y cada uno está reflejado en ella. Entonces, estos monumentos los basa ella en la teoría de los actos del habla, en donde el habla configura, en donde el habla hace que ocurran cosas, donde el gesto es una acción que refrasea y que instituye el pasado. Entonces, los quiero dejar. Entonces, con Widrich va a haber una sesión de preguntas. Espero que tengan una tarde maravillosa de un pensamiento muy profundo que a todos nos tiene que llegar en estos momentos del país. Un saludo a todos nuevamente y bienvenidos.
Thank you so much for the nice invitation and the introduction. My lecture today is entitled Performative Materials and Activist Commemoration. Commemoration, which I would define as public remembrance, is always a reclamation of the past in the present. This applies to monuments as well as memorials, to rituals, activism, and even to vandalism, or the destruction of monuments. In the last 100 years, negative reactions against traditional monuments and the claim to stand in for often state-approved history have intensified. Monuments have been criticized for their authoritarian or colonizing force, for their literal invasion of space, and conversely, for falling silent due to their endurance, their immobility, and their banal appearance. Think of a man on a horse. This criticism was and is important. Monuments have not stood still before this criticism, but have themselves gone through rapid change, especially in the second half of the 20th century. The authoritarian regimes of National Socialism and Stalinism in Europe, and I would add colonial regimes in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, worked with what the modernist architectural critic Siegfried Gideon called, in the mid-1940s, pseudo-monumentality. Using a style borrowed from antiquity without any reason beyond the hint of power and endurance. Such monumental forms were especially suspect after World War II, so much so that the German philosopher Theodor Adorno could write in his aesthetic theory, first published in 1970, that, quote, "The more people were tortured in the cellar, the more the roof rests on classical columns," end quote. People saw the problem with monumentality, but did not want or could not let go of the energy monuments could create. How to make monuments democratic, how to allow people to think through history and to incorporate memory and personal approaches. How to question historical dogma instead of simply affirming it. How to bring more voices and histories into the history with capital H. I will today talk about commemoration, performative power, a concept I will explain, and, maybe surprisingly, care. I will make the case that history is of utmost importance for a functioning society and a functioning public sphere. And I will think about physical objects and sites in relationship to the virtual sphere of today's media world. Today, in an age of rapidly expanding use of electronic media, history and its images are complicated topics. Online platforms increasingly serve or pretend to serve as the voices of conscience, whistleblowing, and protest. But they are also bastions of conformity and self-congratulation, not to say of political manipulation. Social media also, however, needs to be taken seriously as part of the public sphere. In fact, as part of the public space. With smartphones, we are both offline and online, in physical and virtual space at the same time. It might not be easy in such an era to make a case for commemoration, for memorials and monuments that stand still somewhere pointing at history. Much quieter than the viral chatter, a term that seems inappropriate to use in the middle of a pandemic. I'm certainly not the only one who has liked or shared a political article before properly reading it, much less questioning its source or argument. The presentism of social media is in conflict with the patience needed to listen to and work through history. But it might also be able to help it. Whether we think of Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat as culturally important or a waste of time, we have to admit they play a role in today's construction of history and in how we use and define public space. I'm starting with our contemporary social media condition in order to ask my first question. Do we still need actual objects in public space in order to commemorate? Do we even need a physical public space to come together? What does the materiality of monuments mean? The fact that physical monuments are made, constructed,
una
that they need
cosita.
labor to be made
Me están
and to
diciendo
preserve.
que el
What does it
audio
mean
y a veces
that
la imagen
material-based
se va a hacer a
monuments require long
problema
and often
de
unresolved
técnico,
debates
digamos
about the
interno.
location,
Podríamos revisarlo.
not to mention large
Que hay
sums
un
of money
muy
that could be
extraño.
spent otherwise. Would it not be easier to avoid all this and go into virtual spheres,
Me
not
están
annoying those
diciendo
who do not
personas
want to
que les
engage in the act
envié
of
vínculo y
commemoration?
están
And
conectadas
bringing
y no
those
sé,
together who
Carol, si me
want to.
puedas confirmar con YouTube cómo vamos.
I wrote this paragraph before March 2020.
La otra cosa,
claiming
William,
that
es
this
que
was a dangerous approach.
al principio, cuando estábamos Mechtild,
It seems we all feel
María
this now, as
Belén y
most of the
yo,
world has been or
dice
still
Inés
is
Arango,
under lockdown.
traductora.
And we all have experience with stay-at-home orders or
Por si
curfews,
puedes revisar eso.
while in the last weeks protests are again making people meet up outside.
Que dice traductora
But
y
why
no
do I think we need to
traductora
have
en
debates,
la, digamos, en
conflict,
la,
tensions, and objects
lo-
or
la
sites,
descripción
actual physical
de mi
sites, no
nombre?
matter how small, if we want the democratic access to history and commemoration, which are necessary for a democratic society? Here I have changed my point of view a bit in the last few years, or maybe I'm just defining it more clearly. Not, I want to add, to favor traditional
Es
big
una letra
statues
y me
or the
parece grave
massive
que
use of
salga así.
materials. I'm still unsympathetic to traditional monumental forms and have also started to think more deeply about the use of
Me están
materials in
diciendo que se
art
están
making
oyendo los
and to
micrófonos de
minimizing
nosotros. Me acaban de
a
llamar.
wasteful approach to natural resources. Let me briefly discuss the role of the object and what I see as its connection with bonds of responsibility. A responsibility to history and to each other. My first example is the debate about Confederate monuments in the United States. These monuments commemorate the short-lived Confederacy of the Southern states that wanted to hold on to slavery, seceded from and attacked the United States, which had not yet abolished slavery in 1861. The Confederate States were defeated in 1865 at the end of one of the 19th century's bloodiest wars. As you might expect, the former Confederate States were hardly allowed or wanted to celebrate their defeat in the immediate years after the Civil War. But with the passage of time and the intensification of race terror against African Americans, commissions arose to celebrate Confederate war heroes. The war became a grand and honorable lost cause, and ultimately an insistence on white supremacy of the settler colonists, as my colleague Kirk Savage from the University of Pittsburgh has shown in his brilliant research. The Robert Lee Memorial in Charlottesville, Virginia, was built after the First World War, for example, a time of race riots and segregation. It was also a time of nostalgia for the slave-owning South, powered by the Hollywood media machine, notably in films like Gone with the Wind, which is still the best-selling film in history, adjusted for inflation at least. The Charlottesville monument, ignored for decades, led to protests and calls for removal some years ago, partly because of the political tensions under President Trump. Unlike Trump's remarks about preserving such monuments for their beauty, which is a moot point because most of them would go to museums rather than being destroyed, both the right-wing partisans of the monument and its left critics cited the preservation and rectification of history as their motive. But they had a very different sense of history. I would like to focus on these notions of history, not only insofar as they connect to the physical nature of a monument. The reason stone and metal are central to traditional monuments. They are durable materials. They change little outdoors, especially bronze with its protective coating. They seem as stable as the history. They represent a history constructed from above and told to the people. But bronze can be used very differently for more interactive projects. One of my students, Sandra Shim, wrote her master thesis on the Korean monuments erected for the victims of sexual exploitation under the Japanese occupation during World War II. Entitled Statue of Peace, the first statue by Seo Kyung Kim and Woong Sang Kim was made on the occasion of the 1000th occurrence of the so-called Wednesday demonstration, a weekly protest demanding an apology by the Japanese government and public acknowledgement of the comfort system of World War II. Comfort system is a euphemism, of course, problematic, obviously, as a term. She showed me the images you see here in which people had given the statue of the girl standing in for all women who were forced into sexual slavery, a coat, a scarf, and other warm clothing during winter. On one hand, this was part of the success of the monument, that it allowed for care, for empathy, that one could start understanding the history through those small gestures. You see a chair next to the girl inviting the audience to sit with the statue and become part of the work. The bronze sculpture itself is idealized. The girl is wearing a ceremonial hanbok dress and has a bird on her shoulder, as if a sentimental symbol of her pure soul rather than any direct confrontation with pain. The monument was replicated many times, popping up in Korea via crowdfunding and several initiatives, and later in the United States in Korean communities. I'm glad the monument became so popular, but there's something off-putting to the traditional material and form, which the audience might have sensed. The clothes make her more approachable, individual, changes the statue, makes it malleable, or at least hint at that. The history of the project is complicated, with the political activism by several survivors coming first. Going public was difficult for them, and they needed to fight off prejudice that they had voluntarily gotten involved with the enemy. The acts of care, then, are important, performative gestures that allow for change in attitude. The chair in which the audience can sit and commit to listening, to acknowledging these women's history, is an obvious invitation to engage. But it is also conventional, and I'm more interested in the act of clothing, the sense tension between the foregrounding of a history of violence and the choice of material. Showing these acts on social media also played a role, of course. But what I would like to emphasize is how the material, perhaps even in its apparent limits, its hardness, its coldness, its brutality almost, worked in the object's transformation by living people. It is not just the image of a girl that elicited these reactions, just as the real survivors struggled so long without sympathy. I think the cold metal, and not just the form it took, is one reason there seemed to be a need for something soft and warm. Is the statue then a failure or a success? I think it's productive for the care that it made possible, but also for showing us that activism and monuments have become closely linked, and not always just as activism against monuments. In both cases, the Confederate monuments and the Comfort Women Memorial, activism was helped by social media to bring attention to the underlying topics in society. In both cases, the monuments in public space are at the center of the debate, the Confederate statues as examples of long, outdated ideologies that remain, the remains of which keep reminding us that history always needs work, if sometimes the labor of removal of such signs of racist ideologies. And the girl in bronze, that the empathy that emerged in the society can become a visible sign on the object. Here I can already answer some of the questions I asked at the beginning, namely about the need of actual objects in public space. They are needed. While they might connect to public spaces online, these alone are just not open enough. They are too controlled by companies, administrations, and the law of the strongest, often in the terms of money. On the other hand, materials and objects need to be different in our contemporary society. There's a need for new forms that allow democratic access. But they also need to be forward-looking in terms of material. How these relate to our state of the world does need consideration. Here in Bogota, for example, the project by Doris Salcedo connects to my two examples via the material, metal. But this is where we need to pause. The metal here in Bogota is not a resource taken from the ground. It is a recycled material, if you wish. Weapons taken out of the circuit of violence and melted, reshaped with the help of victims of sexual violence. This change of the material disconnects from, but also connects to, traditional monuments, both stable and not, steady and lasting, and also showing us the exact opposite. No matter how tough and uncompromising history seems, and how impossible it seems to react against injustice and to bring voices to the foreground that have been silenced, it can be done. The performative act of the engagement of female survivors of sexual violence becomes one step to change history, but is also the labor of commemoration for them, a labor that allows for negative feelings and aggressive force. The material and its changes symbolize history and how we as individuals have the right and the power to shape it. Here, the monumentalization is not stable, but one step in a construction of history full of tensions, ambivalences, and interpretations. The circulation instead of the use of new material is also an acknowledgement that history cannot be erased. The weapons and the violence are and will remain part of it. But the material shift shows that they can be reactivated differently. And this is the brilliant and surprising, maybe even shocking part, to move through the violence. Both audience and object change, and the interaction between them is both historical and visceral. Let me come back to traditional monuments and their changes in site or material. Monuments can fall out of use, they can fall silent, and they can be contextualized, moved into a different context to stand in for a new version of history, or even to stand in for a new historical event. This applies to stolen war trophies, but also to artistic practice. May it be a proposal to let plants overgrow an unwanted monument, or just a conceptual detail that changes the way we see the monument. How is this connected then to the change or removal of material? When the activists in the United States called for the removal of Confederate statues, they did not always discuss what this would mean. I agree that some of the monuments need to just leave public space, but I want to be clear here. The notion that the disappearance of the material would solve history is simplistic. And this is apart from legal difficulties, as some of the monuments were paid for by private organizations or on ground not owned by city or state. Monuments are part of the construction of history. However, they cannot destroy history. We cannot destroy history by destroying a monument. A shift in the material presence, however, can change the future. Here we are again asking what the object does and what the interaction with an object means. A performative gesture can initiate a different social reality. The reason for this is that monuments function only in relation to the audience. They are nothing without us interacting with them. But this is also their force. The value of art lies exactly in how such shifts occur, not because objects are magical or operating on their own, but because they can be made operative in a performative operation between participants and their relation to history. To explain this process, I need to recall my earlier work on commemoration. In my book, Performative Monuments, which came out in 2014, it is, I explained commemoration in the last decades of the 20th century as a social practice emerging from performance art around 1970. In calling these monuments performative, I don't just mean they perform something, but I employ a term coined by British philosopher J.L. Austin in his book lecture series, How to Do Things with Words, to describe how certain speech acts, like a promise or a marriage ceremony, enact the very reality they describe. A promise can be a legal contract sometimes, but in any case, it is a social one. I claim that a functioning memorial enables an interaction with its audience, resting on just such a social contract, requiring the right context, performer and witness, and documents to make the very act of commemoration. In the political context of Central Europe, Germany, Austria and Yugoslavia in particular, I considered works as they functioned for a much belated and often also geographically dislocated audience. After the Second World War, as I noted at the beginning of this lecture, monuments were accused of always being authoritatively installed from above, oblivious to their site and socially dysfunctional or ineffective. Similar insights were already voiced by critics in the wake of World War II and led to demands that statues be replaced by gardens to walk in, community centers or cubist dispersals of form under the slogan of living memorials. This phrase contains a clue. The very emergence of performance art in the 1960s, a mode of art making that has been seen as the opposite of the monument in its temporality and embodiment. Against this, I think that performance art, in fact, held the key to the monument's revival as a supposedly democratic community builder. Austrian artist Wally Export's early street actions, especially touch cinema and Gentle Panic, and their afterlife in carefully staged photographs, are relevant in their mission to interact in public space and to use her body to challenge the notion of an oppressive public sphere full of authoritative power. In the 1960s and 70s, she inserted herself into buildings and spaces as a feminist statue, both the director and the subject of the action, in order to shift the social fabric for the future. The performances were supposed to make visible power structures, gender inequalities, and possibly change them. There was a strong connection to architecture, and in some of the works, the historicist columns and statues of 19th century Vienna are the frame and counter of the body, which moves in reaction to the shape of the architecture while challenging its supposed oppressive imperial tendencies. Export's relatively unknown project for the Holocaust Memorial in Vienna, which is a competition that was ultimately won by Mechtild Widrich, and you see here also really wonderful project here in the image as well, is a good case study of how the thinking in terms of performance fits perfectly the engagement with historical content. Export's design for the Vienna Memorial does not feature her performing, but delegates a performance of history to the audience. We are meant to walk through a tunnel, one side of which consists of dark stone, one side of glass. In doing so, the individual acts of remembering, or at least its outer appearance, are visible and become very public, with the audience as part of the work. So that means you're supposed to walk through the tunnel, but because of the glass plane, there's like a broader audience on the square that can see you performing commemoration. So it's a very active public acknowledgement of the act of commemorating. Export envisioned a computer-selected audio program featuring Jewish authors to be randomly played during the walk, resulting in individualized oral experiences. The site was chosen by the city, and it is important. It is the authentic location on top of a medieval synagogue that was destroyed at the time of medieval pogroms in the 15th century against Viennese Jews. But this is not just a matter of placing a piece of sculpture. It is our movement over this place that, as in performance, establishes a geographic and with it a historical link. Export wanted the medieval dig exposed and visible through a glass floor with running water between it and us mediating the view. The project was wildly impractical. Imagine what archaeologists would say about installing a stream of water over the old excavations. But in her aesthetic ideas, Export is not alone. Some of the key artists of the 1980s and 90s surrounding commemoration involved both in performance and in memorials. Visible mourning was used as a means to take on responsibility for whom was not completely clear in the country of Holocaust perpetrators. And this might have been another problem with this particular proposal by Valdi Export. The concept of performative access to history by the audience also allows for individuals to approach and work through the past more easily than if they are just fed a historical dogma. The corporeal being in space can open up history to a broader range of personal approaches. The outcome of what history is being made in the encounter with the often fragmented object. The audience is part of the process of history making. This means that the body can be activated in the process of commemoration and in the process of making history. There's the danger, of course, of replacing historical consciousness with mere bodily feeling, and I discussed this elsewhere, but I overall believe that performative commemoration or performative monuments are a good way to connect individuals with their own experiences to history with a capital H. Ideally, historical consciousness and history become part of the creation of a functioning public sphere. I believe that the public sphere is always contested and that it is important to claim histories and historical consciousness and to be aware that governments or majority groups are not always willing to allow everyone access. The impulse, often by politicians, to leave the past behind cannot work if the experiences of individuals in the past are simply dismissed. This also prevents the creation of a functioning society in which the past informs the present. This all sounds easier than it is, of course, and gets even more complex in the case of traumatic events. I mentioned the problem of replacing history with feeling, which in some cases leads to a simplistic equation. If I can make an audience who did not personally experience the trauma feel a bit of it through, let's say, claustrophobic installations or an uneven path or something like that, darkness, it might lead to an understanding. I think it needs much more than that if we want empathy, maybe even care. It needs the ability for those who want to commemorate to explore and relate, interact and question, slowly build history in relation to memory and commemoration, in relation also to other people and their own histories. This brings me back to the question if objects, the performative monuments, do anything by themselves. They cannot. But if we set up openly enough, they can invite the performative process in the interaction between object and audiences, which can expand to interaction between people, of course. This can also include later audiences. This is where mediation can become useful and important, be it mediation via discourse or communication, or via photographic images and film, online or offline. History in the present is politics, and the discourse in which history is constructed takes part in the creation of the public sphere. I would like to think of it as a commemorative action that involves the making of history for the future. Performative means a social interaction that changes the fabric of history. Here I am again going back to its original meaning in speech act theory. Would that need an object or a performance on the ground? I feel that some kind of material or physical event, while not entirely necessary, enables a grounding of history. In the material or physical event. Enables a grounding of history in the fabric of its geographical or imaginative site. We can engage in stories, sites, and material in different yet equal ways, but for me at least, the material presence or a physical site, in particular in its changing form, seem an adequate form to both stabilize and destabilize historical narratives. I do not mean to make a claim here for authenticity. I'm merely trying to understand how interaction with our surrounding world works best. Social media does play a role here. And, even a performance that only takes place once is usually made online, circulated via the channels of reproduction and recontextualization. And of course, also a monument, like all art, is already a mediation in its symbolic value. A factor I did not discuss in my book is one that seems to matter more and more in recent years: care. First prominent in feminist discussions, care ethics has emerged as a powerful category from psychology to architectural discourse. And I would like to thank Elke Krasny, professor at the Academy in Vienna, for introducing me to the concept in more depth. Care relates back to the question about the relevance of the labor needed to make and preserve objects. Without care, objects and sites can disappear, and without care for commemoration and for public discourse, the past will not help us for a better future. But more broadly, we are at a point in history in which we understand that care for our environment is necessary for our survival as a species. The care as attitude also relates to the performative engagement with the past, and the care extends to objects or sites that might allow an easier access to this past. Activism for or against monuments can be seen as care for the society. And to see care for the survivors, starting with a quote for the Korean girl in bronze, might seem strange. But it seemed a shift in the approach away from the simple aggression against Japan towards an engagement with those who had to live the horrible history. What I would still criticize in these particular memorials is that there was no careful reflection about the material, that it was chosen for traditional historical connection with monuments and elevation in the traditional sense. But if monuments work in the present, if they want to connect the past to a hopefully changed future, it seems important to work with the condition of the present tense, to react to where we are now as a public, how to find materials of care that are not taken from the ground as if we had endless supply. The reuse of the weapons as materials in Salcedo's work also speaks of this current moment. Care can be forceful and allow for the tensions and negative feelings to emerge as part of the process of moving forward, like here. But care is also a gesture in itself, performative in how it allows for change, and performative because the gesture of caring can be used to invite a broader audience into the performative change of a historical narrative. I'm therefore delighted to be able to discuss these concepts here, unfortunately only virtually, in a space that, in my opinion, has brought together these ideas in such a powerful and moving way. Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Buenas tardes de nuevo. Queremos invitarlos a que nos pregunten cosas, le pregunten cosas a Mechtild por los varios chats en Facebook, en YouTube. Vamos a empezar con las preguntas que ya tenemos, así que las voy a ir leyendo en español y después las traduzco. La primera pregunta es, ¿se podría anticipar que los monumentos empezarán cada vez más a incluir la posibilidad de cuidado en la interacción entre los monumentos y la comunidad? En el monumento Comfort Women, del que hablamos sobre las víctimas de violencia sexual en Corea, los gestos de cuidado fueron una reacción espontánea a la frialdad del material y simbolizaron la empatía por las víctimas. En su investigación ha encontrado otros ejemplos donde el cuidado haya sido un concepto central de la propuesta artística de conmemoración en el espacio público. So Mechtild, the question is about the monument Comfort Women and the politics of care within the monuments. So have you come up or studied any other monuments or any other examples where care is a principal and main theme within the artistic proposals?
Mm-hmm. I think there are several monuments, even starting in the 1980s, that work with direct interaction of the audience. I mean, the classic example is often in Hamburg, Jochen Gert's memorial against fascism, where you had to sign in a LED surface. So that is interaction. But then after that interaction, someone needs to take care of that pretty precarious object, because otherwise it can be destroyed, and it was actually attacked, it was shot at. And so the question is, at which point I think a civic society comes together maybe and makes a decision that they want to care for an object that is important for the history and for the construction of history.
Could you repeat the name of the monument?
Okay, it's in Hamburg, Harburg, so it's a suburb of Hamburg, and the artist is called Gerz, G-E-R-C, Jochen, and this is one of the first so-called counter-monuments in the German-speaking world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, but there are a couple of others, I think, more recently who think about very directly about the environment. You could say that all monuments or memorials that work with nature, for example, are very much about care. Even a memorial.
I will start translating and then we'll continue, okay?
Absolutely.
Entonces, Mechtild nos dice que esta corriente del cuidado en el monumento empieza en los años 80 y hay un ejemplo que ella tiene, que es el monumento de Jorgen en los suburbios de Hamburgo, que tiene una construcción precaria, delicada, con luces LED, que ha sido destruido, de hecho. Entonces ella cree que lo fundamental en este proceso es que exista una comunidad que quiera cuidar al monumento, que quiera prevenir este tipo de ataques, por ejemplo. Y nos empieza a decir también que cuando los monumentos empiezan a involucrar a la naturaleza o procesos ecológicos, ahí es donde realmente el cuidado también empieza a interactuar con cómo el monumento reacciona ante la comunidad o cómo la comunidad reacciona ante el monumento. Okay, Mechtild, did you have anything else to say about the question, or is that it?
No, I think, and I will keep it shorter so you can translate.
Okay, listo. Entonces, eso es todo por esta pregunta. Seguimos con la siguiente, que es, usted menciona una mayor conciencia alrededor del uso responsable de los recursos naturales por parte de los artistas. ¿Qué nuevos materiales se están comenzando a utilizar en la creación de monumentos? El Bataille Monument, presentado en Cáceres en el marco de la Documenta 11 en 2002, es un ejemplo importante en su trabajo sobre monumentos performativos. ¿Qué características tuvo esta propuesta? So Mechtild, you mentioned in your conference that there has been an increasing awareness of the use of materials lately in monuments. Also thinking about ecology and how to be responsible with resources. So what new materials have been used lately to create monuments? So, and the example would be, for example, the Bataille monument that was presented at Castle in Documenta 11 in 2002. So what kind of characteristics did this proposal have? And what else can you say about this?
So the issue of, so materials have always been important for monuments. No, it is not a coincidence that stone and metal is being used because it's durable, right? So I'll let you translate that. Then I go on.
Ok, entonces los materiales siempre han sido muy importantes en la construcción de monumentos, sobre todo teniendo en cuenta la durabilidad de estos materiales.
Mm-hmm. And with I think the new conception of a monument, a lot of people are also questioning if we need to keep putting new material into public space in terms of extracting resources. So now some artists are working with recycled material, for example. I mean, Salcedo, of course, is one extremely smart example because it's not simply recycled, it's reused, it's taken out and brought into the sphere of art. Okay, let me go on.
Entonces, el cuestionamiento que hay últimamente sobre la necesidad de poner monumentos en el espacio público, también empieza a generarse un cuestionamiento sobre por qué extraer tanto material para ponerse en el espacio público.
Mm-hmm.
Could you repeat the last part, please, of the last sentence you said?
Well, maybe I just go on. For example, there's Ai Weiwei, the Chinese, very famous Chinese artist, has a lot of projects where he works with safety jackets that were left by refugees who were trying to get into Europe by boat. And he makes these big monuments using the safety jackets. So it's on one hand, again, recycling material that would otherwise be considered waste and problematic because it's plastic. But on the other hand, the material speaks, no? Like Salcedo's material, it speaks, it's recycled, it's reused, but it also speaks because there is a history attached to it, as opposed to just using metal and creating something out of it.
Entonces el reciclaje ha empezado a tomar una parte importante en la construcción de monumentos. Ella habla de un monumento de Ai Weiwei, este artista chino, en el que él reutiliza las chaquetas de seguridad de los inmigrantes. Entonces, claro, son materiales que igual son poluyentes y plásticos, pero se reutilizan en la construcción. Sí, cada material está como impregnado de significado, vale, en Fragmentos, en la obra de Salcedo, donde ese material ya tiene una carga previa, que no es lo mismo que coger un material, una materia prima y usarla para ese monumento. Is that it, Mechtild, or did you want to continue?
No.
That's it. Okay. Seguimos con otra pregunta, y es ¿cómo la ruina es un monumento e invita a la transformación performativa o al abandono y la soledad de la reflexión tan necesaria hoy? ¿Qué piensas sobre este concepto de ruina? Esta pregunta es de Rocío Pérez. So, the question is, how does ruin become a monument, and how does it invite to transformation and performative transformation, or to abandonment and the loneliness of reflection, which is so necessary today? What do you think about the concept of ruin?
Thank you. Oh my gosh, this is really interesting, but also difficult to answer. So a ruin would be a monument that becomes one not because it, not when it's built, but because of age. It has a certain age value. And what this means is that the ruin shows history through the transformation.
Okay,
So-
let's stop there.
Yeah.
Entonces, la ruina no es ruina porque esté destruida, sino porque tiene un pasado y una historia. Could you repeat the last sentence you said, please?
So it shows history, no? The transformation, and that was what is missing, and the decay can be a sign for history.
Claro. Entonces, el decaimiento de una ruina es un signo muy poderoso para demostrar la historia y digamos, el trazo de la historia.
Mm-hmm. But like any object, it needs people, humans, who start interacting with that history and who start taking care of it. So some ruins are probably forgotten for a lot of complicated reasons, and no one cares about them. And some ruins can become these incredible signs of a performance of history into which we can engage or to which we can add. Mm-hmm.
Pero entonces, como todo monumento, la ruina necesita de una interacción con las personas y con el presente. Entonces hay algunas ruinas que están completamente olvidadas.
And I think they can allow us an access to history. That's what a ruin can do, and that is wonderful because of its, authenticity, or because it has been through history.
Entonces la ruina tiene el potencial de generar un acceso a la historia y por eso pueden ser muy poderosas.
Did I answer the question, or was there another part of the question? Then remind me, please.
No, this is good.
Mm-hmm.
It was about, yes, what do you think about the ruin?
Mm-hmm.
So let's continue. ¿Cuáles son, la siguiente pregunta es, ¿cuáles son las principales diferencias entre el contramonumento y el monumento performativo? Esta es una pregunta de Carolina Fandiño. So what are the main differences between the counter monument and the performative monument?
Okay, so counter monument is a term that was introduced in the 1980s by a scholar, James Young, and he had a lot of very good observations, but also some that I disagree with, and this is why I do not like the term as much. The biggest issue I disagree with is that he claims that counter monuments go against the idea of monuments, and that they are not authoritative. But I think monuments always need a certain amount of power, but they can have democratic power, and that is what a performative monument is.
Okay, so can you repeat the name of the person?
James Young like being young, and
Okay.
he coined the term counter monument.
Right. Entonces el término contramonumento fue introducido por James Young. Y Mechtild no está tan de can you repeat the last part of your sentence?
I lost you for a moment. So Young claims that counter monuments have no authority and that this is why they are democratic. And I'm saying no, monuments need authority, but authority can also be democratic. And that is if they are performative, if the power is given to a lot of people who can construct the history.
Claro.
So
entonces, sí, el contramonumento, en teoría, según Young, desafía la autoridad y rechaza la autoridad. Widrich dice que el monumento necesita tener algún tipo de autoridad. Entonces, el monumento performativo lo que le aporta de diferente a esa definición, que la autoridad está compartida de una manera democrática. Bueno, tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más, así que va a ser la siguiente. Usted propone que la conmemoración como práctica social tiene que ver con el lenguaje y con cómo ciertas palabras llevan a la acción. También menciona un término adoptado del filósofo J.L. Austin, podría expandir un poco sobre esta relación entre el discurso, las palabras, la acción social y la performatividad. So, Mechtild, you say in your text that commemoration as social practice has a lot to do with language, and you use a term borrowed from J.L. Austin. Can you expand a little on this relationship between discourse, words, social action, and performativity?
Thank you very much. Yes. So Austin is famous for looking into the power of language. He actually decoded German codes in World War II, so he knows that language can be very powerful. And
let's stop there. J. Austin es conocido y es famoso por teorizar sobre el poder del lenguaje. De hecho, decodificaba los códigos en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Keep going.
And so he looks into language that does things. So if you get married, you say, I do, and it's just a word, but after you say it, it is legally binding. Right? Because there's a convention and there is a public, a witness. And I use a similar idea for commemoration. Okay, yeah, translate this.
Entonces, investiga el lenguaje que hace cosas. Entonces dice que, por ejemplo, cuando uno se casa y dice, sí, me quiero casar, es una palabra, pero es una palabra que conlleva unas acciones y es legalmente poderosa. Entonces, ella tiene unas investigaciones y como una propuesta sobre eso que nos va a contar ahora. Yes, keep going, please.
And democratic commemoration is neither authoritarian, that someone tells you what the history is and you have to just believe it, nor is it, some fun activity, because you need to take the responsibility also to construct history as part of society. So it's a social contract, very similar to, a vow, like, yes, I do. I work through history. And in the best cases, art can, or like the performative monuments can initiate such a process where you feel, yes, I need to be aware, I need to work through.
Entonces, la relación con este filósofo y con el lenguaje es que la conmemoración democrática lleva consigo un compromiso que puede tener que ver con el contrato social o con el contrato del voto de la palabra de sí en el matrimonio, pero lleva consigo este compromiso de decir la acción comunitaria, digamos, la acción democrática.
Well, there's more, but I think that's it for now.
Thank you so much. So, one last question, una última pregunta. Esta pregunta es de Leila Cárdenas. Y dice, queda claro que se han reevaluado los monumentos del pasado como signo y en su razón de ser. Si hablamos en términos contemporáneos, se debería seguir hablando de monumentos, monumentalizar. ¿Para quién es realmente un monumento cuando se comisiona usualmente instrumentalizando el arte para servir un discurso de la historia oficial? Okay. So it's clear that the monuments of the past have been reevaluated as sign and in their reason of being. If we talk about monuments in contemporary terms, should we still keep talking about monuments and monumentalizing? So who's a monument really for when it is often instrumentalized to fit official discourses about history?
Yes, thank you. A great question, and I keep asking myself, should I use the term, or do we need to get rid of the term, get rid of monuments, and look for other means? But I feel it is worth not letting go of the term because it is powerful, but to reconsider it. And initially a monument is just a mark to think
Gran
about.
pregunta, todo el tiempo se pregunta sobre la necesidad de la palabra y del término, pero dice que vale la pena seguir utilizando el término, porque es un término que es muy poderoso y que se puede ir reajustando y reformulando.
Mhm. But I understand everyone who says, you know, we need to get rid of it. I think because monuments are in public space and public space is limited, if we want to make our democratic mark in public space, maybe it's worth using the term to say we are also here. You know, we're not just using social media, we're not just using small stuff, which can work. But yeah.
Pero ella entiende muy bien a las personas que quieren replantearse el término, que quieren rechazar el término, pero es poderoso decir monumento o monumentalizar para generar presencia en el espacio público, no solamente haciendo cosas desde las redes sociales o desde cosas pequeñas o micro. Entonces el término sirve como para generar presencia y establecerse como en un punto de vista como comunidad.
Yeah, thanks. Yes. That's good.
So I think this is it, Mechtild. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Entonces, gracias a todos por sus preguntas, por estar hoy